everyone. Thanks for joining international programs today for this virtual chat. My name is Colette Sterling, and I will be hosting on behalf of international programs today. We're excited to sit down with our guest, Dr. Andrea Duffy, to talk about her new book, NOMAD'S, Pastoralism and French Environmental Policy in the 19th Century Mediterranean World. Dr. Duffy, thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you, absolutely.
So Dr. Andrea Duffy is the director of the International Studies program and a special assistant professor of history and international studies here at CSU. In 2019, she published NOMAD'S, which examines the impact of French environmental policy on subaltern populations in the Mediterranean region during the colonial era. So let's start diving into this. Dr. Duffy, tell us a little bit about your book.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, this is a Mediterranean history. That means it connects different states, cultures, and societies throughout the Mediterranean world. In this case, I use 3 case studies that kind of represent 3 different points of the Mediterranean: Provence in southern France, southwestern Anatolia, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, now part of modern-day Turkey, and then northern Algeria in the south, which was a French colony. So it's a Mediterranean history. It's also an environmental history. That means that it's examining the relationship between humans and the environment in the past. In particular, it's looking at land use by Mediterranean mobile pastoralists. So that means sheep, shepherds, nomads, and their role in the development of modern environmental policy and environmental ethics over the course of the 19th century. So its central argument really aims to solve a bit of a mystery. At the beginning of the 19th century, if you went to the Mediterranean region, if you go back in time, you would see that it was largely the domain of mobile pastoralists who herded sheep and goats, mostly between coastlands in the winter and high mountain pastures in coastal ranges in the summer. But by the end of the 19th century, this age-old tradition had all but disappeared from the region. So the question is, the mystery is essentially, what happened to all the sheep? And I argue that the answer had a lot to do with politics. During this period, French scientific forestry was also being developed, so in the early 19th century. And this new science, new forest science, offered new perspectives on the environment, as well as new tools for regulating environmental exploitation. One central perspective of French scientific forestry was that the Mediterranean region had suffered severe environmental degradation, and French foresters at the time believed pastoralists were to blame. I mean, this is largely because there were so many pastoralists in the region. So they were kind of obvious scapegoats, pun intended. And they particularly blamed certain practices such as burning for pasture, as well as extensive grazing by sheep and goats. And it's true that sheep and goats in particular can have a negative environmental effect, but we now know that it's a lot more complicated than these French forest agents thought in the 19th century. So anyway, the French state was particularly eager to embrace these ideas because pastoralists were kind of a thorn in their side. They were unruly, they moved around, so they were difficult to tax. They didn't really represent the state's idea of like a good modern French citizen. So as a result, anti-pastoral regulations became a really central part of modern French forest legislation. And then this anti-pastoral perspective was even more important when France colonized Algeria in 1830. So there, it applied the French forest code part and parcel, even though Algeria is a very different environment, so it really didn't make sense, but they did. And they used it as a tool to dispossess indigenous Algerians, many of whom were mobile pastoralists. So then the final piece is many of the same, or some of the same French forest agents who were involved in anti-pastoral legislation in France and then Algeria were invited in the mid-19th century to the Ottoman Empire to establish modern scientific forest legislation there. The Ottoman Empire also had a significant mobile pastoral population in Anatolia in particular, And so also in Anatolia, similar kinds of tactics were used to marginalize Anatolian nomads. So ultimately, this French scientific forestry really had an impact all around the Mediterranean. And that impact was in many ways profoundly negative, not just negative on mobile pastoralists, but also negative on the environment.
So, what inspired you to take this topic of connecting history and science and land use and colonization and actually write about it in Nomad's Land?
Well, I mean, the inspiration was kind of, it kind of just came together. I didn't necessarily know that all these pieces would be connected when I first started researching it, but connections kept popping up. And I'm not a historian of science, but science is obviously a really important part of this. And I think one thing my study shows is that, or reminds us of, science is a part of history. It evolves just like history evolves, right? So in the 19th century, the science said that pastoralism was bad, that it was detrimental to this environment. Today, science says that actually mobile pastoralism is one of the most sustainable ways to use the Mediterranean environment. So science it's completely changed in that period. So I think this reminds us that science is, and always has been, bound up with politics, bound up with power, and also culture, and history is too.
Mm-hmm. What were your greatest challenges in researching this topic?
There were a lot of challenges. So this book is based on my dissertation, and I don't recommend anybody ever take on something this broad for their dissertation. It's really a bad idea. For one thing, the sources were a huge challenge. So I think nomads are really cool. That's why I wanted to research nomads. And they are cool, but they're really hard to research because they don't write things down. And so especially when you're researching nomads in a period where you can't just go and study them now. I mean, for one thing, they've mostly disappeared from the region, and this is the 19th century, so they're all dead. You know, and the tools that we normally use for history really don't apply, or don't apply as well here. We usually use documents, and like I said, nomads don't write things down. So I had to be really creative in trying to access their perspective, and really tell their story in this narrative, just kind of like dancing around them to try and get at them. And that was really challenging. Another major challenge was, and this is kind of classically why I probably shouldn't have chosen this, but oh well, too late. It's very transnational. Most histories kind of stick to one country or one place. You know, you do US history or you do French history. And so I end up intersecting with a lot of different subfields within history. I mean, I know I have a lot of colleagues who have similar aspects or study similar aspects to what I do in Middle Eastern history, but they don't do French history too. And then I have same thing for French historians. But my study really does both. It oversteps Europe. It connects Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. So it's really kind of working across 3 continents, a bunch of different languages. In order to research this topic, I already knew French, and I had the privilege of living in France and working at a French university while I was researching this. So that was helpful. But I also had to learn Turkish. I had to learn Ottoman Turkish, which is, I think it's got to be one of the most difficult languages out there. It's a dead language. It's not spoken anymore, which makes it particularly challenging to learn. And Arabic as well, also a totally different, challenging language. Oh, and I also used sources in German. I think that's about it. But a lot of different languages I had to work with. And then finally, because it's so broad, because it's transnational, it's kind of a messy story. And so it was a challenge to think about how to organize it in a coherent way. I was very gratified when I assigned this to my graduate seminar that I'm teaching now. I'm teaching World Environmental History graduate seminar, and my students were like, "This is so well organized." And I thought, wow, I'm kind of surprised to hear you say that. It definitely was a lot of work to get there. Did a lot of moving things around and over explaining and sort of signposting to try and get there, but definitely was a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely sounds like the voice or the power of quantitative data is definitely a major part of this.
Yeah.
So when we're thinking about the audience that would be interested in this topic or would like to read this book, who did you have in mind?
Well, okay, so I won't lie. It's primarily aimed at historians
Mm-hmm.
or scholars of history, but I do think it's accessible to, and I also think it's relevant for a much broader audience. At least I hope so. And so one reason why is because it's so broad. I had to do a lot of extra explaining because it really just, anybody who reads it, even a historian, they're going to be a specialist in French history maybe, or maybe Ottoman history, but they're not going to be a specialist in both. And they're probably not going to be a specialist in environmental history also. So it just overlapped so many different subdisciplines within history that I had to explain a lot more than most scholarly books would. So that makes it more accessible. It's also fairly interdisciplinary. I mean, a lot of environmental histories are interdisciplinary. They draw methods and sources from different fields, and this one's really no exception. So in addition to history and history sources, it also draws on geography, anthropology, and also connects to those fields, as well as I think political science and some of the natural sciences, especially ecology. So it's relevant for those fields as well. But I also, I think it's relevant beyond a scholarly audience. And so I hope curious members of the public, policymakers, environmentalists, social justice advocates, and, just any curious anybody wanting to know more about sheep in the Mediterranean and history will be able to find this book and find it accessible.
Yeah, it sounds like it has a very broad applicable audience for sure. So for students who are reading this book, how can they take sort of the ethical framework that it's teaching, that it's showing, either was or wasn't used, and how do they be critical and mindful of that as they go on their ed abroad journeys?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Well, this book was actually inspired originally by my own study abroad experience. Even though it's based on my PhD dissertation, but really got its spark a lot earlier when I was an undergrad, and on a whim, totally on a whim, I decided to study abroad in Turkey, basically because I didn't know anything about it. And then here I am. I teach Middle Eastern history, and I'm a historian of the Mediterranean world. So it obviously changed my life. I think studying abroad is always transformative, and it has a strong potential. It doesn't necessarily do this, but it has a strong potential to cultivate a sense of global citizenship, a sense of belonging to a wider world rather than just, being focused in our community or our local community or our community of friends or our state or country. And I think that's really important. I think it's important because it will help foster those kinds of ethics that I'm talking about, listening to people, being open-minded, and being concerned about the world because we all live in it and we're all part of it. So yeah, I think study abroad, you should all get out there if you can. You don't know where it will lead you. Maybe it will lead you to write an amazing book someday.
No.
Yeah.
So finally, why is it that you think, and this can touch back to the previous question too, why do you think the subject is important for people to focus on right now?
Well, that's a great question, because I think a lot of times historians, we write about, I think we've chosen this field because it doesn't require us to write things that are relevant. If that, I don't know, makes sense. But I guess it's easy to retreat into the past. when you talk about issues in the past that at the time were extremely controversial, they usually aren't that controversial now. So it's a way of sort of avoiding conflict, avoiding having to figure out solutions and to challenges. I mean, in the past, you know how things turned out, so that kind of makes it easy. So it's easy for us to have that kind of cop out, I think. But I think also for me, I really feel a personal mandate to make what I do relevant, and to make those connections explicit. I've always felt that way, but I especially feel that way now as director of international studies, because international studies is also interdisciplinary, and it connects history as well as a bunch of other fields to the present. So I always think about, like, how is this relevant? And I absolutely think that history is relevant, and that we need to pay attention to history. So in this case, I think my book provides an example of the ways that people in power have deliberately, and in this case successfully, marginalized Indigenous groups, and also justified that marginalization. And in this story, they used environmental claims to justify that marginalization. So it's an interesting kind of maybe seemingly contradictory perspective on the history of environmentalism and conservation. Unfortunately, this is not a unique story, or even unusual. And it still happens, and it's still happening. So I think it serves as a cautionary tale, and I think it has important lessons for the contemporary world, for social justice and for global environmental governance. And just to give a specific example, so 19th century French foresters figure prominently in the story, but they're not the antagonists. They're not evil. In many ways, they could be considered some of the earliest conservationists. They really wanted to save the world, and they wanted to save the world by planting trees. And they genuinely thought that that pastoral practices were unsustainable, and that they were doing the right thing by eliminating them. They were wrong, right? So we now know that they didn't have a complete picture. And we now know that pastoral practices were actually more sustainable than what ultimately replaced them. So I think this story shows us that environmentalists and conservation agents need to be receptive to local needs and to local knowledge in particular. And also that they really need to include people in their vision of a sustainable future, right? We can't separate the environment from the inhabitants who live in our environment. And even talking about it as the environment versus our environment is a bit problematic, I think. So we need to be careful about that. I also think this message applies to international development workers and social sustainable enterprises, because it shows that good intentions do not necessarily yield good results. And it shows us that community engagement and buy-in are key. If those foresters had done more to listen to local pastoralists and to recognize that their age-old practices maybe were more sustainable than they thought, we would have a very different picture today. So just as a contemporary corollary, I think those of us who have power and have privilege need to take care to avoid a white savior complex, which in many ways is just an update of the civilizing mission. And that's something that figures very prominently in my book. So we really can't prioritize the environment in a way that ignores people and ignores those people's perspectives. We need to remember that we're all part of this earth and that we're all connected, I guess.
No, I love that. I think in almost every form of activism work, it's important to learn from history. It's important to understand your connection to it, and also your connection to the land and how you walk upon it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I think as you are watching this content, a round of virtual applause for our guest, Dr. Andrea Duffy. Her book is available from CSU's bookstore and online for purchase. This video, as well as others, will be available on International Program's Vimeo page and our YouTube page as well. Stay connected with us on our Facebook and Instagram pages to hear what we have planned for the future and to see up-to-date content like this. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Duffy.
Thank you. This is fun.